Upon completing Dragon Age The Veilguard, I really wanted to give a day or two before I thought about my time with the game. But before we dive into the video, I will be discussing certain narrative elements tied to the ending of Dragon Age The Veilguard, so there will be spoilers for this video. When I first kicked off my adventure in Veilguard, I was really excited that Dragon Age is back. And I'm going to try to steer away from cliches like Bioware returns to form or anything of that nature because that has been done to death on so many different review sites. Because while I believe Veilguard is a step in the right direction, claiming that it's a return to form for the developer that has created so many iconic RPGs is a bit of a stretch. Because on the other hand, this feels like the most divisive Dragon Age to date due to its overall simplicity, and that extends to all aspects of this game, which then made it feel overly safe up until about the end. Also, I think the pace in this game is not great, and I'll get into that, but it's clear that Bioware is trying to pick itself back up after a few disappointing releases. Anthem was not great, and while my stance has softened on Mass Effect Andromeda, it's still not as good as the main series. And while I don't believe there's anything wrong with Veilguard, it really is a competent game. You can have a lot of fun with this title. I can still see it dividing the fan base because it's been over a decade since Inquisition, and we are starving. To kick things off, let's talk about the gameplay found in Veilguard. I think it's pretty good. And to me, as a fan of modern action adventure titles like God of War, I was pretty excited to see that Veilguard was very snappy, is very responsive, very flashy. I had a really good time with that. I thought it was a lot of fun. The only issue I had with combat is that on normal difficulty and up, enemies can be really spongy. And even though the game does a decent job of allowing you to optimize your lineups and gear, it can become pretty repetitive after a while, especially when you're starting to dive into some of those side quests. The good news is, if you're a fan of Dragon Age 2 and wanted to see what that would look like in the modern day, you no longer have to wonder as Veilguard has you covered. Now, the caveat to that is if you are a fan of every other Dragon Age title, then you're going to be out of luck because while you do have control over what abilities your teammates have and use in combat, it's not going to require much in the way of critical thinking. I didn't really think of this as a deal breaker, but I have seen fans of the series on social media lament the fact that the strategy mechanics that make up the best Dragon Age games are absent. That doesn't mean you're not going to be using any type of strategy because as encounters do become tougher later in the game, brute forcing your way through certain sections can be a real chore. So you're going to have to manage who your party attacks and how. It's not turn-based combat, but it's largely fine. And that feeling of fine really extends to the puzzle solving and environmental exploration aspects that make up the gameplay. Well, I mean, solving puzzles in this game is really simple. There are a few that require a bit of legwork and thought, but those are generally reserved for optional puzzles. The ones that are meant to impede you during a quest can be insultingly easy. And I'm talking God of War Ragnarok with your companions solving the puzzles for you easy because your companions will tell you what needs to happen. It's like we know that there is a mechanism that needs to be opened, and we know that there's only one mechanism in the game that is opening these areas. So we don't need to be told what to look for because when you're going through some of these areas while they are open in these quests, it's fairly linear, it's straightforward. You know that it's either above you or behind something. It's not really hard to look for. I just found it weird that they constructed these puzzle sections to impede the player to give you a break from the action. But in doing so, they really kind of just made them annoying to get through, especially when you're going through the later parts of the game, when you just want to get into the action because some of the set pieces found at the end can be really awesome. Now, in regard to exploration, I really enjoyed combing through these environments. Veilguard is gorgeous with some of its locations, and it is a lot of fun just going in and seeing the different details that Bioware included. The locations that are tied directly to a character quest that takes you to an area that's not connected to the crossroads, I think all of them are fantastic. I really enjoyed seeing the different vistas and seeing what secret chest I could find because there's always something hidden. It just takes a little bit of extra effort to get there. If anything, exploration is probably my favorite part of Veilguard in terms of gameplay, and I don't really think it's that close. So, what I've just described in terms of the gameplay mechanics that make up Veilguard have become fairly standard in action RPGs. The complexity is going to vary from game to game, but for the most part, I think Veilguard is competent, and that makes it feel familiar and safe. The lack of risk, though, found in the gameplay is not a problem because I believe that there are moments where the gameplay loop can be really satisfying. I think when everything starts to click and you're flowing and you're kind of just ripping enemies apart, a lot of fun. And I do believe that there's a decent balance as it pertains to exploration and combat, especially for the main quests. The side quest or any character specific quest, however, lack any real variation. You are either talking or fighting. There is not an in between. And if there's no in between, the writing needs to be able to carry these moments because the game does like variety in mission structure and it is very noticeable as the game goes along. And unfortunately, the writing is another example of the game being too safe at times for its own good. The beginning and middle of this game really feel like something out of a Marvel film. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, it is a noticeable step down from previous Dragon Age games. Because regardless of how you felt about the gameplay in those titles, at least when you made critical choices, it felt like there was a tangible effect. You had characters constantly questioning their actions and their beliefs because the things that you did in these games could be seen as a direct challenge to everything that that character has known up until that point. When you were making choices, whether it was sparing a character or siding with a specific kingdom, you would see that change reflected in the world and with your party. It made the world feel reactive, and it felt like your choices mattered as it related to your relationships. It felt like it created tension between you and your team, and it's something that's largely absent here. So I'm going to say this a few times, but the main conflict has two elven gods running rampant across Theta. They're essentially uprooting the way the elves look at their culture and their history, and while you should be expecting an insane amount of tension wherever you go because of how dire the situation is, the world instead feels largely static, which was really strange to me because there's a choice that you make around the midpoint of the game, I think around the end of Act 2, in which you have to decide what ally you need to work with to mitigate the damage done from a dragon to a particular city. Now, regardless of what you choose, the area that you left to get attacked is permanently changed. And this is represented visually. But when you're there, it doesn't feel much different when you're exploring the city because the people there don't outright despise your character, and there should be some resentment there. Not a single shop should be selling anything at its current price, and I think people, especially those who I've made allegiances with, they should be looking the other way because my decision ended up killing a large part of that population. I was waiting for some type of consequence, and it never came. These are the type of moments that should bring tension to not just the world itself, but also your party's relationships. Because the game tells you that your choices may make certain party members become hardened as a result, but you don't really feel that awkwardness when you're talking to them. I just left the entire city of Minrathis to die. And I did that in front of Nev, who's a character I actually like, and she should be furious. She should be pissed because you receive a missive from her saying that, hey, there's a lot that happened. I have to go check on all these people. And I would have been perfectly fine upon her return if she ended up resenting my character in some way, but it never really gets there. You kind of talk around the situation, which was kind of weird because in other Dragon Age titles, you can kind of sense that feeling of unease. But here it's like people are like, whatever. And that's reflected in the fact that you have so many opportunities to repair the relationship, even though it's clear your choice had dire consequences for that character's home or their friends or family. It's one of the most weird things I've seen in this game. Like they're trying to make it just a little bit too happy and too charming and too cheeky. And I'm like, dude, we just leveled an entire city. People are dead in the streets. There's a cart full of bodies. It's okay if you hate me, Nev. I'm completely fine with that. My expectation going into this game was that it was going to be like previous Dragon Age titles at the minimum, meaning there would be consequences for my actions. And that would be reflected in the writing as I progressed through the game. You'd see it in the dialogue, you'd see it in the storytelling, all that stuff. I was largely disappointed with how safe the game played it in the beginning and in the middle. Because when you're playing through this game, you're looking at the first two acts and going, when does it actually connect? When does it get cohesive? And it's not until you get to the end where Veilguard starts to actively take risks. And to me, this is the high point of the game. Your decisions in this act actually mattered in the moments, and it finally reflected the urgency of the central conflict. I'm repeating this again. Two elven gods are running rampant. It's an apocalyptic event. This is a very dire time for everybody. The narrative should have been incredibly grim, and there should have been multiple instances throughout this game where relationships fracture with factions and party members, and they had the opportunity to tell a really compelling story. Instead, you're just kind of chilling and hanging out until you realize that you are fighting two gods and you have to trust Solus, who just so happens to be the cause of everything. You spend a lot of time in Veilguard trying to understand Solus and empathize with him, which is kind of disappointing to me because I was looking forward to beating his ass after what he pulled in Inquisition. Now, the finale of Veilguard felt a little like Mass Effect 2 to me, even if it was the discount version of it. You could say that Veilguard is the Wish version of Mass Effect 2. I would not blame you. You really don't have to think too hard about who to send to do certain tasks. It's actually pretty easy to get through. Regardless, I really enjoyed the final act, but it left a sour taste in my mouth when those end credits rolled because I was wondering where this had been the entire game. Every single Bioware RPG requires you to strengthen your bonds because eventually those bonds are going to matter. But I shouldn't have to wait to the end of the game for them to matter. At least challenge the bonds a little bit. Give me a little bit of strain. And don't be afraid to take risks. You're not going to upset the fan base because they're used to that, because that's how Bioware used to approach storytelling. It was very frustrating because I think the writing was all bad. It was a bit cringy at times, but it just didn't reflect the urgency of the conflict, and it took too long for things to start to gel. It was just too safe at times until it wasn't. And I mean this when I say it. Veilguard feels like two different games once you get to the finale. When you are literally going through Act 1 and Act 2, you're just recruiting people, getting to know them, having a good time. Dragons attack, you have to fight people, and then you have to stop yourself and then get to know them some more. And then you get to Act 3, and then all hell breaks loose, and then you remember that this conflict is going to affect everyone in Theta. By the time I had gotten to the end, I was honestly pretty burnt out on the game. Veilguard really drags its feet at times, and that is primarily due to the dated quest structure. Quests in this game are not connected. Once they end, you get some text scroll, some rewards, you feel good about yourself, or you feel bad because you did something wrong, and then you're back at the lighthouse, which as a central hub is completely fine, but running to every character to acquire quest or dialogue is really grating. It's fine when the party is small, but when you have a full team and you have to make the rounds, it's not that fun. In my opinion, it would have been very cool if you could just receive a missive and then accept the quest, but whatever. Look, what I'm trying to get at is that the quest structure found here in Veilguard is dated, and it really muddies the pace between acts. And what's strange to me is that BioWare kind of decided that instead of having this organic relationship building, that you pretty much had to go to your map, find these characters, and then as you were talking to these characters, it was like, hey, I have this mission. Hey, I have this quest. Hey, let's go do this. Let's go talk. And then these missions would take anywhere between 10 to 30 minutes. And then once you completed all these missions, it was then, hey, we have to do this main mission. You remember we were doing this? We were fighting these two guys. It really felt like it just kind of put a stop on all these different proceedings because, there is an apocalyptic event going on. And I remember in Mass Effect 2, if you happen to delay yourself for far too long, like if you weren't actively trying to build relationships as the game went along, it would potentially kill more people in the suicide mission. And I felt like maybe that was what's going to happen here in Veilguard. because you were kind of lulled into this false sense of security because the writing felt so safe and all that. But really, that's not what goes down. In fact, the game kind of celebrates you building up these relationships, even though it tries to throw it in your face near the end of the game. There's an entire conversation of you and your team sitting around the table, pretty much stating that you guys have to get rid of the things that are bothering you, otherwise, you could die. Which is why I call this the Wish version of Mass Effect 2. That final act is essentially that suicide mission. And to me, that was kind of frustrating because it lacks subtlety. And that was usually a staple of previous Bioware games. If you played any of the Mass Effect games, you were kind of going in blind with some of your decisions because you were just kind of waiting with bated breath to see what the consequences were. Here, you kind of knew what they were. Now, there's probably one big twist, I would say, that kind of throws a wrench in that when you get to that final act part. But at that point, for me at least, I was like, okay, that happened. No big deal. At least they tried to take risks here. I really appreciated that. It just took so long to get there. Once the end credits had wrapped and I had time to really digest my thoughts about this game, and I took that day or two before I actually started writing, I really felt like the one word that I just kept centering on was safe. And throughout this video, I've kind of described that safe for me was disappointing. And I do think that safe for a number of Dragon Age fans and Bioware fans is disappointing because the expectations for this studio is really high and has been high for a long time. And I think that we tend to hold them to this very high standard because they were the standard bearers for the RPG genre. That's who Bioware had been. But I think that with Veilguard, it's practically clear to me, at least, that whoever Bioware was years ago, when they had pushed out KOTOR, Jade Empire, Dragon Age, Mass Effect, that Bioware is gone. And this became evident when you were getting to these really big decision-making sequences. And what you found was that this game really wanted to be in your face about it, instead of actually having subtlety and nuance. And I really felt like that essentially Dragon Age The Veilguard was a reboot for the whole franchise, but also a way of Bioware introducing itself and trying not to do too much to really muck up the process so that people hated the game and didn't buy it at all, because I think this game is going to sell well. Is it going to meet whatever lofty expectations that EA has? No, but I do believe they made a really competent, solid game that a lot of new fans are probably going to like. But I think a lot of older fans are probably going to say to themselves, like, you know, this could have been done better, or this could have had a little bit more depth in terms of its mechanics. But I think there's enough good stuff here for fans to kind of attach themselves to the next Mass Effect game, at least be interested in what the next Mass Effect is going to look like, because I think that people are going to be a little bit more forgiving with what happened here with Veilguard, with how safe they were willing to play it. But I think that's not going to extend itself to Mass Effect. I really do think the writing needs to be vastly better for Mass Effect 4. I really don't think fans are going to accept anything less. Because here's the thing, it's not like Mass Effect Andromeda. It's not just some spin-off where we're trying to go in a different direction. We are trying to continue the story of Shepard. Why they're trying to run this, even though it felt pretty definitive at the end of Mass Effect 3, I don't know. That's completely up to Bioware. But I'm not going to lie when I say I'm holding out hope that the next Mass Effect game is going to be a real return to form for Bioware. I'll remain cautiously optimistic after playing through Dragon Age The Veilguard, just kind of sitting there and pretty much saying to myself that it felt like a step down. But at the same time, it is a massive step up from Anthem, and I do think that this is a better game than Mass Effect Andromeda. So, who knows? But let me know what you think in the comments, because that is going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.